Hello and welcome to the PhD Life Raft podcast. I'm Emma Brzezinski and today I am talking to the wonderful Charlotte Haines Lyon. We are talking about review meetings. They get called all sorts of different names: upgrades, annual review, progress report, but they all share in common the potential traumatizing experience. So today we are talking about how to navigate those moments and also why it's really important to have a place to vent about them. So I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, Charlotte.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here and for having an amazing microphone, because this is like so clear. I was like, oh, wow. So thank you so much, because this one is going to be a good one. It's a topic that comes up a lot in terms of that kind of that upgrade moment. And so we're gonna get into that in a minute. But before we do, I'm going to ask, as I do for everybody, for you to tell us a little bit about your PhD journey.
Okay, well, thanks, Emma, for inviting me onto this. So I started my PhD when I was 40, and my youngest child was 5.
Wow.
And I decided before then I always wanted to do a PhD, but I could never commit to doing something part-time for 5 to 7 years because that took a long time. But actually it only took 3 minutes for her to get to 5. So I thought, oh, I'll go for do it after all.
Yes, that's how it is.
So I spent 7 years doing it with 2 young children. As they will tell you, it was over half their life that I spent doing it. It took me 7 years.
Wow.
And it was in education. So I was looking at democratic parent engagement in schools. It was action research. And it was really tough, but I also loved it. And I think the thing for me was that I had been quite a competent professional for many years, or 20 odd years, and then started this PhD and felt really incompetent, which was a huge shock. So that sort of really shook my identity. And I'd also been a professional writer, so I'd been paid to write for various people. And then to discover that I couldn't write academically was again a massive shock. So that sort of really impacted my confidence. I think that was sort of it, that sort of coloured the first few years of my journey quite considerably, shall we say.
Yeah. And I think this is such a common experience, sadly. People feel infantilized, they feel de-skilled. This is deeply problematic. And rather than being offered as a kind of, wow, this is an opportunity to learn and develop, it's kind of like, it feels like falling apart. And I do think we need to attend to that, or at least warn people. Warn people, because people think, oh, this is just me. It isn't. This happens to most people, I would say.
And that's what I've discovered since. Yes, it wasn't just me.
No, and I think it's. Yeah, well, I mean, that is a whole nother podcast episode, and maybe I'll get you back on that. But linking then to this upgrade moment, it gets called different things.
Yes, we call it transfer, but it's the same thing.
It's a kind of, so it's this moment where you've started the PhD research. You've had a year or so, depends, again, different institutions have different amount of time, and then you come to this first moment of kind of presentation of what you've been doing, sometimes to a big panel, sometimes to a couple of people, with a report of what you've been doing. And I know that you have a story to tell about your experience, so tell us that.
Yeah, well, if you don't mind, I'm going to talk about my first annual review before getting to the upgrades, because they were quite different and it sort of impacted the second one, if that makes sense.
Yes, please do.
So in our institution, you have, if you're part-time like I was, you would have a progress review sort of a year in, and then you have your transfer 2 years in, or 6 months in if you're full-time and 1 year in if you're full-time. So I had my annual review, and it started off by going, so why have you chosen this way of doing it? And it felt like I was being really undermined. Because if I'd been asked that in my previous job, like, well, why have you done this? I was like, well, we've discussed this and we've agreed it. What, and you know why? Because I've written 10,000 words on it. It felt really odd to me that they were asking and the supervisors were asking. It was the way it was sort of done, and I was really thrown. Then we
Yes.
it was fine. We had quite a long, robust discussion about it. But by the end, I felt that I'd really struggled and that they didn't like what I was doing. And I'm saying this, I don't think that's what they said. That's
No.
how I felt.
Yeah.
And I didn't know if I'd passed it. I thought that maybe I was on the verge of being thrown out again. Not that they'd said anything to lead me to believe that, but that's how I felt.
Yeah.
And I cried for about 3 days at home. And I remember sitting in the bath just crying, and my husband just bringing me glasses of wine. Just going, I don't know what else to do. And I was like, well, I'm just going to stay and just spite them all then, you know. And it was really, really hard. I then went to my upgrade really nervous because I'd just felt so awful in that first experience. And actually, it was a really different experience. Really helpful, and we reviewed stuff and we looked at it. But what they said at the end, and it sort of lived with me forever, and it's made me think about how they went through the list of things they were looking for, and they said, right, so you've been able to show that you can argue for your ideas and defend your thoughts. And I was like, oh, is that why they're asking the question? Not because they think that I've got something wrong, but actually they're testing my ability to argue. And of course, in a professional workplace, you don't really get tested in your ability to argue. What they're interested in is, have you done your job?
Yes.
And that was a real shift in the way I kind of understood the role of those events. But it was communicated sort of at the end rather than at the beginning.
Yeah. Blimey.
And I just, so for me, it's like that needs to be, if that is a thing, that needs to be communicated. That's one of the roles of the event, I think. And that is such a fundamental thing to me. Maybe it isn't for other people, but it really sort of changed the way I understood everything.
Oh, this is brilliant, and we're gonna get in a minute, because in a minute we're gonna solve all the problems. We're gonna say what we think, but let's just stick with the difficulty at the moment. I think, if that's okay, in terms of the crying in the bath, because you won't have been alone on that, and I know this is a very anxiety provoking experience for a lot of people, because, as you say, I didn't know if I passed or not. It's this sense of it being an exam.
Yeah.
Of course, a lot of PhD researchers are high achievers. They have flown through their exams. That's why they're where they are. And this sense of an exam, very high stakes, especially because by the time you get to this moment, you have invested a lot of time, energy, potentially even money as well into this. So it's really deeply meaningful. Also, it's probably the first time that you presented your ideas more publicly, in a formal kind of setting. So these kind of tender notes that you have been writing, these shoots of ideas that have been you've been nurturing, now are exposed to the elements. And I think that what you talk about in terms of this, the annual review and then the upgrade, and again, different institutions are going to call it different things, but I think what you're saying here in terms of the way that it's framed up and understanding what you're stepping into is really, really important.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody had really prepared me for that. They were just like, well, we just reviewed the progress. So, but it's there's intricacies to it, which I think are neglected, or it's just assumed that you'll know.
Yes. It's academia I think the way I try and understand it in terms of being generous spirited is a kind of, it's a spirit of kind of generosity of like, oh, well, everybody will know what this is. We're just doing this all together kind of thing. That's the generous reading of it. Of course you will understand. Of course you're welcome. And of course, but this is not how people experience it often. It's like, it's like smoke and mirrors, and come, into the inner sanctum where you're not quite sure what's going on. People are kind of swooping in and out and making decisions about you. but I think this, what you're talking about in terms of clarity and understanding, and then that there will be different meetings are doing different sets of things.
Yeah.
So this sense of the progress review and the upgrades, and how far apart were they for you?
They were a year apart for me.
A year apart. Okay. So I think that's also, we need to just mark that these they're not regular occurrences, which again ups the ante on it.
Yeah.
But also means that you don't get a lot of practice at it. You're kind of in.
Yeah.
So I suppose why we're unpicking all of this is because what we wanted to do in this episode was just to say to people, this is a tricky moment. It's okay to feel it as a tricky moment. But there are things that we could start to do to make it better. And I know that you, having had your awful experience of people not really explaining what's going on and then feeling like you'd failed, which clearly you hadn't failed. You'd done really well.
Yeah.
You've done really well. That's the thing, right? And that's the thing as well, isn't it? Nobody sits at the end, brilliant, well done. It's just like, yeah, thanks very much, bye.
well, I think that was part of it. And then there was an added sort of kick in the teeth when I got the report, which was a couple of months later. It says something like progress and it says satisfactory. Well, I was in education, and at the time satisfactory was being changed to requires improvement.
Right.
And satisfactory is seen as a really, really bad word.
Yes.
So I questioned the registrar. I was like, why does it say satisfactory? I thought this was like the worst thing in the world. And it's like, no, that's like all you can get. It's either satisfactory or unsatisfactory. They're the only two options. I was like, what fresh hell is this?
Oh my God. And 2 months later. And 2 months,
this
sit there for 2 months.
And I suspect they might have said I'd made satisfactory progress in the meeting, but because that word is so like such a bad word in my head, I would not take it,
Exactly. And so to note that this is how the PhD is as well. It's like a pass fail thing. So it's not, you can't really ace it in that way, if you see what I mean.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that threw me for a lot of the PhD was you don't get marks. So, you can't gauge how well you're doing. So I permanently thought I was on the edge of being thrown out. Because you don't get 70% or 60% or 55. Yeah. You just, there's no sort of gauge. It's a really, really strange experience.
Yeah. So this is not good. Having people sitting around waiting for comments that they don't really understand, having been through an experience that they didn't really know what was going on, and thinking that they were awful when actually they were brilliant. This is not a good situation. So can we have your thoughts on how this, and indeed what you do now as good practice to improve these experiences for people?
Sure. So I now supervise quite a lot of PhDs, but also professional doctorates. So I make it very clear from the start that they will be having an annual review and what the role of the annual review is and the kind of feelings they might have. Quite often tell them about my experience, not trying to frighten them, but just go, it is kind of normal to feel a bit rubbish, but hopefully we can make it better by understanding what you're going into. Because I supervise people in education, I do explain that word satisfactory because it's still used, and they look at me going, are you kidding me? Is that really the word they use? So I'm glad that I always do explain that one. So I try and make sure that my own supervisees know what they're going into. But also when I run a review, as it were, or chair a review, I do try and acknowledge what the role of that is, and it might be a bit of a strange feeling. And try and give them sort of some time to settle in and sort of say, this isn't a test. This is about time to explore what you're doing, trying to look at your ability, can to actually defend your ideas. That's part of it, because that's what you have to do in the Viva. So looking at sort of explaining what each bit is, so it's not too strange. And then make sure by the end of it, they really know where they stand. So, generally, which is fantastic job, really excited to see what you're doing, looking forward to seeing this work, developing. There have been a couple of times where we have had to say, well, actually, it's not satisfactory progress, but this is why I'm making it really clear what support is there for them and where we're going. I mean, that's only happened twice, and that's horrible. But also recognizing that I'm not doing anybody any favors to kind of pretend everything's fine. So it's not about being nice all the time, is it? But it's, I think, making it really clear to people where they stand, but what support they can have and why, and not really leaving the room until I know that they do understand that, if that makes sense.
Yes. Because of course the voices in our heads are always going to tell us that it's been rubbish and we are terrible and we didn't do it right. So actually having a bit of external feedback can be really useful. This is great in terms of knowing where you stand and knowing what that meeting is around. And just again to clarify that there are going to be different kinds of formal meetings. So that progress meeting, where it's kind of like, how are you doing? Where are you at? Ideally, as you say, ideally, that's going to be helpful to you. Ideally, that's going to go, yeah, no, I'm still on track. Brilliant. Somebody else who doesn't know my work has chaired that meeting and gone, well done. So I can hold on to that. And it's an overview meeting. It's a kind of management meeting. And then those upgrade meetings where you're kind of, is this a viable project? Is this viable? And so it isn't about, it's not like you say, it's not an exam. It's like, let's help you shape this up so that it's possible, because everybody's, usually super ambitious for the project. Want to do 3 million things. And actually it's like, it's okay, just do those 2. That's fine. And it is very usual that you will get feedback and things will need to change, and that doesn't mean it's wrong. It's like, let us help you shape it up.
And I think it's help you shape up, but it's also not just about the work. It's looking at how do you manage all that. So that's some of the time we take, is like, how are you going to manage this practically? And so just talking in terms of, this is a useful meeting. This is useful in terms of, it might be your only chance to really discuss it in this way before your Viva, even though that might be 5 years down the line. But also, yes, how can we shape this up? And, it's useful to have external people to the project, because the supervisors, everybody's so in it. And I know this is a supervisor. It's so useful having somebody from outside the team to take that critical view.
Yes.
And quite often, spotting really good things that maybe have just been taken for granted. So I think it can be a really positive experience.
Yeah, exactly. And we're doing the hard sell on this as a positive experience, and people will be like, I don't believe you. But I think that sense of actually, if you can come to that meeting, as you say, knowing what it's about, understanding that it's not you being examined in that way. This is about a project management meeting. Is this a viable project, and how do we if it isn't, how do we make it so?
That's it. So it's not this sort of, I can't think of any sort of massive fails or anything. So occasionally it's like, you might need to just do X, Y, and Z before we can kind of go through the full upgrade. But
exactly. If they were
it's like seeing it, that's okay, because at the end of the day, it might add another 3 months on. Well, frankly, with the PhD, so what? It's a not quite yet, and I think we have to get over this mentality. And I'm saying that as somebody who would be devastated, and and had to extend my PhD 3 months at the end. But actually, it doesn't matter, and I was really pleased I did in the end. But all those things at the time just seem so big, don't they? And I think it's also about us in the room recognizing how big that all feels when we're giving that feedback.
No, it is a big moment, but if they were going to chuck you out, they wouldn't be spending time on a meeting with you. Do you know what I mean? So if you've been invited to one of these meetings, it's a good sign, right? It's good. You're on track. So I think, first of all, that sense of like, this isn't going to be chucking you out moment. That isn't that you, if you were in trouble, you would know that before.
Yes.
Well, we would very, very, very much hope so. So this is about then shaping up. Lots of people get feedback on that. That doesn't mean it was wrong. It just means let's take it in a particular direction. And as you already said, it's this sense of it's one of these weird academic rituals that has all this kind of baggage within it in terms of what is going on in there. It's an entry into that way of being, which we do need to be a lot more transparent about, as you say, in terms of testing argumentation, that, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that's what it is, and that's not done in the real world. It's in the professional world. I know, but it doesn't feel we're very real sometimes, does it?
No.
But and it's a different type of conversation, I think, to what you might have at a review.
Yeah.
In the sort of outside sort of industrial workplace, for example.
Yeah.
And I think it's somehow explaining that to people, and getting it across that that's okay. And I think what you were saying about actually you wouldn't be invited to this review if you were failing, because actually we should have had that conversation before. I think that's really important. And I do try and say that you always say, have you engaged with me as your supervisor? Yes, you have. Have you done all the work? Yes, you have. So you probably don't have that much to worry about.
Yeah.
If you'd gone AWOL, then, I probably wouldn't even be having this conversation with you. So
Yeah. And it's that sense of coming to this meeting thinking, what can I get out of this meeting?
Yeah.
Rather than subjecting yourself to a torturous experience. And it's probably not going to be a pleasant experience, but hopefully it'll be a really useful and productive experience in terms of you getting some really useful thoughts, some guidance. And I say, ideally, you do feel better afterwards, but we can't promise you that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, some of that is just being really sensible and trying. And I know it's not easy because we've all got busy lives, but building in a bit of time afterwards for you just to recover, because it's really intense. Even if it's the best experience ever, it's really, really intense.
Absolutely.
So
there will be a hangover. Absolutely. Yeah. What you will not do is go, right, I'm going to come out of that meeting and then I'm going to get on with it. No. Something nice afterwards, definitely. Yeah. And also probably, like you say, a bit of a pause in terms of, okay, let me just let all of that settle. And maybe some time for reflection and journaling, the sense of, okay, what went on there? I think that's really, really good advice.
Maybe go out for a coffee with a friend who's been through it all, that you can just have a bit of a bitch and moan about it, And it's not that you're bitching about the terrible people in there, but I think it's quite important just to let that out. And, I always say to the people I supervise, please go and bitch about me. That's absolutely fine. You need to let that you need to let the steam off. I think that's really important.
Yeah. No, I used to say that at the beginning with people in terms of like, you will hate me. At some point in this process, you will hate me. You will hate your supervisor. That's totally normal. It's a kind of it's a transference thing that's going on there.
Yeah, and that's okay. And I think we as supervisors also need to just hold that that's okay. I'm certainly not precious about that. So I think it's building in those times for just sort of venting. I think venting is really, really important, and you don't have to sort of carry this. And I think there's really, if you can't do it physically, there's some amazing Facebook groups, aren't there, that you can kind of do that. I know I was in one for sort of parents doing PhDs, and that just saved my PhD, frankly, because I could just go, you'll never believe what happened here. And then we say, well, that's totally normal. Yeah, all right then. Okay.
Yeah. I do think having that, being able to let off steam, because there will be a lot of steam.
Yeah.
I'm aware of time. This always goes so quickly, right? So there's so much in there. And thank you so much for being so honest about all of that. That's really helpful. And so I'm going to ask you now, though, one more thing in terms of a top tip. So do you have a top tip for us to take away?
I think that as supervisors, we need to think and ask the PGR, what do they want to get out of that meeting? And it just changes it a little bit, rather than this is just a test, but what do you actually want to get out of it? And it just puts a little bit of agency back into the hands of the PGR.
So I love that this is a top tip for supervisors.
Yeah.
But I think that's brilliant in terms of, what does the PhD researcher want to get out of this? Really, really important. Charlotte, thank you so much. Thank you for your time here today, and thank you also for all that you're doing for the people that you're working with. Well,
thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure, and it's just great that people are having these conversations, I think.
Yeah. Yes. More transparency and more
Absolutely.
discussions.
Yeah.
Yes to that.
Let's remove that curtain, that everything's hidden behind, I think.
Definitely. Oh, thank you so much. And thank you all for listening.